Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, watching the stars through the cracked viewport. His ship had seen better days. Burn marks covered the hull, and half the weapons were offline, but it was still flying, and that was more than he could say for most of humanity's fleet. The year was 2387, and humans were losing the war badly. The Zephyrian Empire had come from the deep space with thousands of ships and weapons that could destroy entire planets. They had already taken most of the human colonies. Earth's great fleet was gone, destroyed in the Battle of Kepler Station 6 months ago. Now only New Geneva remained, the last human world beyond Earth itself. Morrison looked at his crew working at their stations. They were tired and scared, but they kept working. Lieutenant Lisa Carter checked her screens and turned to him. "Captain, long-range sensors show movement at the edge of the system," she said. Her voice was steady, but Morrison could hear the fear underneath. "It's big, really big." Morrison nodded. They had been expecting this for weeks. The Zephyrians always saved the biggest colony for last. They wanted to break human spirit completely before moving on to Earth. "How long do we have?" Morrison asked. 6 hours, maybe 7, Carter replied. "The computer is still counting their ships, but it's already past 2,000. 2,000 alien ships against their small fleet of 300 vessels. Most of those were not even real warships. They were cargo haulers, mining ships, and passenger liners that brave captains had volunteered for the fight. The people aboard them knew they would probably die, but they came anyway. On the planet below, Admiral Kevin Blake was preparing the orbital defense platforms. Blake was an old soldier who had fought in the first alien wars. His gray hair and scarred face told the story of many battles. He knew this would likely be his last. "All platforms report ready," his aide told him. "The big guns are charged and waiting." Blake looked at the tactical display showing their defenses. 12 orbital platforms surrounded New Geneva, each one mounting massive cannons that could punch through a battleship. But even 12 platforms would not be enough against 2,000 enemy ships. In her laboratory deep inside the planet, Dr. Helen Foster worked frantically on her latest project. She had been trying to improve the shield generators that protected New Geneva. For months she had worked on new formulas and equations, looking for anything that might help. "Doctor, you need to eat something," her assistant said, bringing her a cup of coffee. "No time," Foster replied, not looking up from her work. "I think I found something. If we can boost the power flow by 30%, the shields might hold twice as long." "That much power could overload the generators," her assistant warned. "Then we fix them," Foster said. "We have to try everything above the planet." Mayor Susan Wright was coordinating the evacuation of New Geneva's cities. Millions of people needed to get off the planet, but there were not enough ships. The transport vessels could only carry a fraction of the population. "We need more time," Wright said to her staff. "The military has to hold them off longer." "The captains are doing their best," her aide replied, "but everyone knows the odds." In the fighter bay of a converted space station, young pilot Tony Adams checked his ship one more time. His fighter was old and slow compared to the enemy craft, but it was all he had. Round him, other young pilots did the same. Most of them had never been in real combat before. "Listen up," Adams called to his squadron. "We all know this is not going to be easy. The alien ships are faster and better armed than ours, but we have something they don't have." "What's that?" asked one of the younger pilots. "We're fighting. For our homes," Adams said. "For our families. For everything we care about. That has to count for something." The pilots nodded, trying to look braver than they felt, far across the system. The Zephyrian fleet moved steadily toward New Geneva. Their ships were dark and angular, built for war and nothing else. At the center of the formation was the massive carrier Dominion's Wrath, flagship of Commander Vexthal. Vexthal stood 8 feet tall with gray skin and for arms. His species had conquered dozens of worlds, and he took pride in never leaving survivors. He looked at the tactical display showing the pitiful human defenses. "Commander," one of his officers said, "the humans have refused our surrender demand." "Good," Vexthal replied. "I prefer it when they fight. It makes the victory more satisfying." Back on the UES Defiance, Morrison gathered his senior officers in the briefing room. The room was small and cramped, with barely enough space for everyone to sit. Charts and tactical displays covered the walls. "We all know the situation," Morrison began. "We're outnumbered 7-1. Most of our ships are civilian vessels with minimal weapons. The enemy has superior technology and unlimited ammunition." The officers looked grim but determined, however. Morrison continued, "We have advantages too. We know this system better than they do. We can use the asteroid fields and gas clouds for cover, and we're fighting for something worth dying for." "What are your orders, Captain?" asked his first officer. "We make them pay for every inch," Morrison said. "We use hit-and-run tactics, strike fast, then disappear before they can respond. Make them think twice about every move." As the meeting ended, Morrison walked to the observation deck. Through the transparent aluminum windows, he could see other human ships taking up positions around New Geneva. Some were mighty cruisers with heavy armor and big guns. Others were tiny patrol boats that could barely hurt a Zephyrian fighter. But they were all here. Every captain, every crew member, every fighter pilot had made the same choice. They would stand and fight, even against impossible odds, even knowing they would probably lose. Morrison thought about his family back on Earth. His wife and 2 children lived in a small town in what used to be called Montana. If New Geneva fell, the Zephyrians would move on to Earth next. This was humanity's last chance to prove they deserved to survive. "Captain," Carter's voice came over the intercom. "Enemy fleet has reached the outer system. They're beginning their final approach." Morrison took a deep breath and headed back to the bridge. It was time to make their stand. The first Zephyrian missiles struck the human fleet like hammers falling from the sky. Captain Morrison gripped his command chair as the UES Defiance shook from a near miss. Round him, his crew worked frantically at their stations while explosions lit up the darkness of space. "Direct hit on the cargo hauler Phoenix Dawn," Lieutenant Carter reported, her voice tight with stress. "She's gone, Captain." Morrison watched the light fade from his tactical display. The Phoenix Dawn had been carrying 300 volunteers. Now they were all dead, and the battle had barely begun. "All ships, scatter pattern Delta." Morrison ordered into his communicator. "Use the asteroid field for cover." The human fleet broke apart like a flock of birds, each ship heading in a different direction. It was the only way to survive against such overwhelming numbers. The massive Zephyrian dreadnoughts were too big to follow them into the tight spaces. Between the asteroids, Tony Adams pulled his fighter into a sharp turn, barely avoiding a blast from an alien cruiser. His squadron had already lost half its pilots in the first 10 minutes of fighting. The enemy fighters were faster and had better weapons, but Adams had grown up in the system. He knew every rock and gas cloud. "Blue 3, follow me," Adams called to his wingman. "I know a place we can hide." He led his remaining fighters into a dense cluster of asteroids where the bigger alien ships could not follow. From there, they could strike at enemy fighters and disappear before the cruisers could target them. On New Geneva's surface, the shield generators groaned under the constant bombardment. Dr. Foster watched the power readings climb higher and higher as her enhanced shields absorbed the alien attacks. The modification was working, but barely. "Doctor, reactor temperature is in the red zone," her assistant warned. "If we keep this up, the whole system will overload." "How long can we maintain power?" Foster asked, wiping sweat from her forehead. 3 hours, maybe less. 3 hours. Foster looked at the tactical display showing the battle raging above. The human fleet was already down to 200 ships. At this rate, they would all be destroyed long before the shields failed. Chief Engineer Paul Garcia worked desperately in the reactor chamber, trying to keep the massive fusion plant from melting down. The enhanced shields were drawing more power than the system was designed to handle. Warning lights flashed red all around him as his team made emergency repairs. "We need to reduce power to the shields," Garcia told Foster over the comm. "The reactor can't take much more." "Negative," Foster replied. "The shields are the only thing keeping this planet alive. Find another way." Garcia shook his head, but kept working. He understood the situation. If the reactor exploded, millions would die. If the shields failed, millions would die. There was no good choice. Admiral Blake stood in the command center of Defense Platform 7, watching the battle through reinforced windows. His orbital cannons had destroyed several enemy ships, but more kept coming. For every Zephyrian vessel they destroyed, 3 more took its place. "Sir, Platform 4 is under heavy attack," his communications officer reported. "They're requesting immediate support." Blake looked at his tactical display. Platform 4 was on the far side of the planet, too far for his guns to help. He had to make a choice that would haunt him forever. "Maintain current targets," Blake ordered. "Platform 4 will have to hold on their own." He watched Platform 4's icon on the display as enemy fire overwhelmed its defenses. The platform exploded in a ball of fire that briefly lit up New Geneva's night sky. 2,000 people had just died because he could not save them. In space, Morrison led the U's Defiance on another hit-and-run attack. They darted out from behind a large asteroid, fired everything they had at a Zephyrian destroyer, then disappeared back into the rocks before the enemy could respond. The alien ship was damaged but still fighting. "Captain, we're down to 40% ammunition," Carter reported. Morrison nodded grimly. They had known this would happen. The human ships carried limited supplies, while the enemy seemed to have endless reserves. Soon they would be firing empty weapons at an overwhelming foe, "Sir, I'm detecting something strange," Carter continued, studying her sensors. "The enemy command ship is moving closer to the planet. Its escort is lighter than expected." Morrison looked at the tactical display. The massive Zephyrian carrier Dominion's Wrath was indeed moving toward New Geneva, protected by only a few cruisers. It was a tempting target, but reaching it would be suicide. "They're trying to get into position for orbital bombardment," Morrison realized. "If that carrier gets close enough to the planet, its weapons will punch right through our shields." He opened a channel to all human ships. "This is Morrison to all vessels. The enemy flagship is making a run at the planet. We have to stop it." "Captain, that's suicide," his first officer protested. "We'd have to go through their entire fleet." "Then that's what we do," Morrison replied. On the planet's surface, something unexpected began to happen. The civilian evacuation ships that should have been fleeing the system started turning around. Captain Amy Rodriguez aboard the converted luxury liner Star of Hope was the first to break formation. "This is Rodriguez to all evacuation vessels," she announced over the emergency frequency. "I'm taking my ship back to the fight. Anyone who wants to come with me is welcome." One by one, other civilian captains responded. Cargo haulers, passenger liners, even small personal craft began heading back toward the battle. They had minimal weapons and no armor, but they came anyway. Morrison watched in amazement as hundreds of civilian ships joined the fight. A massive cargo hauler rammed itself into a Zephyrian cruiser, destroying both ships but clearing a path for the fighters. Mining vessels used their industrial cutting lasers as weapons, slicing through enemy hulls. "My God," Carter whispered, "they're all coming back." The tide of battle began to shift as the civilian volunteers threw themselves into the fight with desperate courage, but the cost was terrible. Ship after ship disappeared from Morrison's tactical display as brave crews sacrificed themselves. For a few more minutes of time, Admiral Blake made a decision that would either save New Geneva or destroy it. The planetary defense cannons had been designed to fire into space, not through atmosphere. Using them now could crack the planet's crust. "Charge the main batteries," Blake ordered. "Full power." "Sir, firing through atmosphere could cause massive groundquakes," his weapons officer warned. "Do it anyway." The massive cannons turned toward the sky and fired. The beams punched through New Geneva's atmosphere like spears of light, striking 3 Zephyrian cruisers and vaporizing them instantly. But the planet shook like a thing alive, and cracks appeared in the ground around the defense platforms. As human losses mounted and ammunition ran low, the situation became more desperate. By the minute, the Zephyrian fleet pressed closer to New Geneva, while the human defenders fought with everything they had left. Morrison knew they could not hold much longer. His ship was badly damaged. His crew was exhausted, and they were almost out of weapons. Around him, the last of humanity's fleet made their final stands against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. But still they fought, because they had nowhere else to run. Communications Officer Danny Clark was trying to keep the damaged radio systems working, when something strange happened. A signal came through on a frequency that had not been used in 50 years. It was an old military channel from the early days of space exploration. Clark put on his headphones and listened carefully. The message was short but clear. "Hold the line. The cavalry is coming." He nearly fell out of his chair. The voice belonged to Admiral Charles Newton, the hero of the First Contact War. But Newton had disappeared 20 years ago with his experimental ship, the UES Horizon. Everyone thought he was dead. "Captain Morrison, you need to hear this," Clark called out, his voice shaking with excitement. Morrison rushed over to the communications station. Clark played the message again. Morrison's eyes went wide as he recognized the voice of his old commander. "Run a full authentication check," Morrison ordered. "I want to be absolutely sure." Clark's fingers flew over his keyboard. The authentication codes were complex patterns that only real military officers would know. After several tense minutes, the computer gave its answer. "Sir, the codes check out." Clark reported. "It's really him." Morrison grabbed the ship's intercom. "All hands. This is the captain. We just received a message from Admiral Newton. He's alive, and he's coming to help us." The news spread through the human fleet like wildfire. On every ship, tired crews suddenly found new energy. Pilots who had given up hope started fighting harder. Even the civilian volunteers seemed to move faster. But Commander Vextel was not impressed by human hope. The Zephyrian leader watched his fleet advance toward New Geneva and smiled with satisfaction. The humans were down to less than 100 ships, most of them badly damaged. "Begin the final assault," Vextel ordered. "I want every human vessel destroyed within the hour." The Zephyrian fleet pressed forward with renewed fury. Wave after wave of enemy fighters swarmed toward the human positions. The massive dreadnoughts moved closer to the planet, their huge guns charging for the killing blow. Tony Adams tried to rally his remaining pilots, but there were only 12 fighters left out of the original 50. His own ship was held together. With emergency patches and prayers, "Blue Squadron, form up on me," Adams called over the radio. "We're going to hit their fighter screen one more time." "Tony, we're outnumbered 20 to 1, his wingman replied. "This is suicide. Everything we've done today has been suicide," Adams said. "But we're still here." The human fighters dove into the enemy formation, like hawks attacking a flock of ravens. They destroyed several alien craft before being overwhelmed by superior numbers. Adams watched his wingman's fighter explode in a ball of fire, then felt his own ship shudder as enemy weapons found their mark on New Geneva's surface. Dr. Foster was running out of options. The enhanced shields were holding, but barely. The power drain was enormous, and Chief Engineer Garcia reported that the reactor could not take much more stress. "Doctor, we have to shut down the enhancement," Garcia pleaded over the comm. "The reactor is going critical." Foster looked at the tactical display showing enemy ships getting closer to the planet. If she shut down the enhancement now, the regular shields would fail within minutes. Millions of people would die. "Give me everything you have," Foster told Garcia. "Redirect all power from non-essential systems, life support, lighting, everything. Doctor, that will kill the people in the underground shelters," Garcia protested. "If we don't do this, everyone dies anyway," Foster replied. All across New Geneva, the lights went out. In the underground shelters, families huddled together in darkness as the air grew thin. They knew what was happening above them, and they accepted the sacrifice. The power surge gave the shields new strength, but it also created a massive electromagnetic field around the planet. Foster watched her instruments with growing excitement as an idea formed in her mind. "Garcia, what would happen if I reversed the field polarity?" Foster asked. "You'd create an electromagnetic pulse that would knock out every electronic device in the system," Garcia replied, "including our own. But it would disable the enemy ships too," Foster realized. It was a desperate gamble. The pulse would knock out their own defenses, leaving New Geneva completely helpless. but it might also cripple the Zephyrian fleet long enough for Newton's mysterious reinforcements to arrive. Admiral Blake saw the enemy dreadnoughts moving into final attack position. His remaining defense platforms had exhausted most of their ammunition. The orbital cannons were overheating from constant firing. "Sir, enemy flagship is charging its main weapon," his tactical officer reported. "Target appears to be the capital city." Blake looked at the massive Zephyrian carrier moving toward the planet. Its main gun could vaporize an entire city with a single shot. There was no way to stop it with conventional weapons. Captain Morrison made one last desperate attempt to reach the enemy flagship. The UES Defiance, along with a handful of surviving ships, broke from cover and charged directly at the Dominion's wrath. "All weapons, fire everything we have," Morrison ordered. The human ships opened fire with their remaining ammunition. Missiles and energy beams struck the massive alien vessel, but its shields absorbed the attacks easily. The carrier's escort ships moved to intercept the human attack. "Captain, we're not going to make it," Lieutenant Carter reported as enemy fire tore through their formation. Morrison watched ship after ship disappear from his screens. The brave captains and crews who had followed him on this suicide mission were dying all around him. But still they pressed forward, because there was nothing else left to do. Captain Amy Rodriguez aboard the Star of Hope saw the UES Defiance taking heavy damage. Her converted luxury liner was no match for a Zephyrian battleship. But she could not watch Morrison die without trying to help. "All hands, prepare for ramming speed," Rodriguez announced to her crew. "It's been an honor serving with you." The Star of Hope accelerated toward the enemy flagship, dodging defensive fire from the escort ships. Rodriguez aimed her ship at the carrier's bridge, hoping to at least damage the command center. But the Dominion's wrath was too big and too well protected. The Star of Hope struck the massive ship's hull and exploded in a spectacular fireball that lit up the entire system. The impact barely scratched the alien vessel's armor. Rodriguez and her entire crew were gone, their sacrifice seemingly meaningless against such overwhelming power. Dr. Foster watched the battle from her underground laboratory and made her final decision. She reached for the master control that would reverse the electromagnetic field and create the pulse that might save them all. "Garcia, cut all power to the shields on my mark," Foster said. "Doctor, are you sure about this?" Garcia asked. Foster looked at the display showing the enemy ships closing in for the kill. Morrison's fleet was almost gone. The defense platforms were out of ammunition. In a few more minutes, New Geneva would be defenseless anyway. "Do it," Foster said. And through the switch, the electromagnetic pulse erupted from New Geneva like an invisible wave of destruction. It swept through the entire system, knocking out electronic systems on every ship, human and alien alike. The lights went out across the fleet as the pulse disabled everything in its path. In the sudden darkness and silence that followed, both sides drifted helplessly through space, their weapons dead and their engines offline. The battle had stopped, but New Geneva now lay completely defenseless, and somewhere in the darkness, Admiral Newton's mysterious fleet was still coming. The electromagnetic pulse had left both fleets drifting in the darkness of space. Emergency power slowly came online across the disabled ships as crews worked frantically to restart their systems. Captain Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, watching his engineers try to bring the engines back to life. "How long until we have full power?" Morrison asked his chief engineer. "At least 20 minutes, Captain," came the reply. "The pulse fried half our circuits." Morrison looked at his tactical display, which was flickering back to life. The Zephyrian ships were in the same situation, their crews working to repair the damage, but Commander Vextel had more ships and better technology. His fleet would recover first, on New Geneva. Dr. Foster watched her instruments as power slowly returned to the shield generators. The electromagnetic pulse had bought them time, but not much. Soon the alien fleet would be ready to finish what they started. "Doctor, we're getting some power back," Chief Engineer Garcia reported, "but the main reactor is still offline." "How long?" Foster asked. "Maybe 30 minutes if we're lucky." Foster shook her head. They did not have 30 minutes. The Zephyrian Ships would be combat-ready long before then. In space, something impossible began to happen. Reality itself seemed to bend and twist near the edge of the system. Space folded in on itself like a piece of paper being crumpled. Energy patterns that human science could not explain danced across the darkness. Danny Clark was the first to notice the strange readings on his sensors. "Captain, I'm detecting massive energy signatures at the system's edge," he reported, his voice filled with confusion. "But it's not like anything I've ever seen." Morrison rushed to the sensor station and looked at the displays. The readings made no sense. It was as if space itself was being torn apart and put back together. Then the impossible happened. Ships began to emerge from the twisted space, but they were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. The lead vessel was clearly human in design, but it glowed with strange energy patterns that pulsed along its hull like living light. "My God," Morrison whispered, "it's the Horizon." The Hughes Horizon had returned, but it was transformed beyond recognition. The ship was twice as large as Morrison. Remembered, its hull seamlessly integrated with technology that seemed almost magical. Behind it came a fleet of vessels that mixed human engineering with alien innovations. Admiral Charles Newton's voice boomed across all communication frequencies, clear and strong. "This is Admiral Charles Newton of the United Earth Fleet. All Zephyrian forces, you are ordered to withdraw immediately or face the consequences." Commander Vexthal, still trying to restore power to his flagship, sneered at the human demand. "One ship does not make a fleet, human. You are still outnumbered and outgunned." Newton's response was swift and devastating. The Horizon's main weapon, a beam of pure energy unlike anything ever seen, lanced out across space. It struck one of the largest Zephyrian dreadnoughts and simply made it disappear. There was no explosion, no debris. The massive enemy ship just ceased to exist. The alien fleet stopped their repair work as shock rippled through their ranks. In 20 years of conquest, they had never seen a weapon with such power. "Impossible," Vexthal snarled. "What kind of technology is this?" Newton's fleet moved with perfect coordination, their ships dancing between the disabled Zephyrian vessels like dancers in a deadly ballet. Each shot was precisely calculated to disable, rather than destroy, showing a level of control that amazed both sides. Captain Morrison watched in wonder as the newcomers engaged the enemy fleet. The human ships moved in ways that defied physics, phasing in and out of normal space to avoid enemy fire. Their weapons converted incoming attacks into power for their own systems. "Captain, I'm receiving a transmission from the Horizon," Clark reported. "Put it through," Morrison ordered. A woman's voice came over the speakers. "UES Defiance. This is Commander Lisa Wells of the Horizon. Admiral Newton sends his compliments and asks that you stand down. We'll take it from here." Morrison shook his head in amazement. "Commander Wells, where have you been for 20 years? That's a long story." "Captain," Wells replied, "but the short version is that we've been preparing for this day. We knew the Zephyrians would eventually come for Earth, so we went looking for help." "Help?" Morrison asked. "We haven't been alone out there," Wells explained. "There are other species who have been fighting the Zephyrian Empire for centuries. We've learned from them, and they've learned from us." As if to prove her point, new ships began appearing alongside the human fleet. These vessels were clearly alien in design, with crystalline hulls that pulsed with harmonic energy. They moved like living things, flowing through space rather than flying. The Kaleri had arrived. Admiral Newton's voice came over the communicators again, but this time he was speaking directly to his old friend. "Jake Morrison, you magnificent fool. When I heard you were making a last stand here, I knew we had to hurry." "Charles, how is this possible?" Morrison asked. "Your ship, these weapons, these aliens. What happened to you out there?" "We found what we were looking for," Newton replied. "The Kaleri Collective has been fighting the Zephyrians longer than humans have existed. They taught us things about space and time that our scientists never dreamed of." The battle was turning into a rout. The Zephyrian ships, still recovering from the electromagnetic pulse, found themselves facing technology they could not understand or counter. Newton's fleet disabled ship after ship with surgical precision. But Commander Vexthal was not finished. The proud alien commander had never retreated from any battle, and he was not about to start now. His flagship was finally coming back online, its massive weapons charging for one final attack. "If I cannot have victory, I will have revenge," Vexthal declared. "Target the planet. Maximum firepower." The Dominion's wrath turned its guns toward New Geneva. The carrier's main weapon, designed to destroy entire worlds, began to charge. Vexthal intended to kill every human on the planet, even if it meant sacrificing his own fleet. Newton saw the threat immediately. "All ships, priority target the enemy flagship. Stop them from firing on the planet." The combined human and Kaleri fleet concentrated their fire on the massive carrier, but its shields were incredibly strong. The ship continued charging its planet killer weapon despite the constant bombardment. On New Geneva, Dr. Foster watched the tactical display with growing horror. Her electromagnetic pulse had disabled their shields completely. The planet had no defense against the incoming attack. "Garcia, how long until the shields are back online?" she asked desperately. "At least 10 more minutes," Garcia replied. Foster looked at the display showing the enemy weapon charging. They had maybe 2 minutes before the carrier fired. New Geneva and its millions of inhabitants were about to be destroyed. But Admiral Newton had one more surprise. The quantum fold technology that had brought his fleet across space could do more than just transport ships. It could bend space itself. All Kaleri vessels execute harmonic resonance pattern 7. Newton ordered. Human ships activate quantum fold containment fields. The alien ships began to sing, their crystalline hulls producing sounds that traveled through space itself. The human vessels generated fields of twisted energy that wrapped around the Zephyrian flagship. Like invisible chains. Commander Vexthal felt his ship shudder as unknown forces took hold of it. "What are they doing?" he demanded. His weapons officer checked the displays with growing panic. "Sir, they're creating some kind of spacetime distortion around us. Our weapon is losing targeting lock." The planet killer weapon fired, but instead of destroying New Geneva, the beam was caught by the combined human and Kaleri technology. The destructive energy was bent back on itself, contained within a bubble of folded space. Vexthal watched in disbelief as his ultimate weapon was turned against him. The contained energy began to tear his own ship apart from the inside. The Dominion's wrath, pride of the Zephyrian fleet, started to break apart under the strain of its own weapon. "Impossible," Vexthal whispered as his flagship began to die. Around him, the tide of battle had turned completely. Newton's rival with his mysterious allies had transformed certain defeat into stunning victory. But the fight was not over yet. Commander Vexthal watched his flagship tear itself apart as the contained energy from his own weapon destroyed the ship from within. Alarms screamed throughout the Dominion's wrath. As hull plates buckled and systems failed, the proud Zephyrian commander had never imagined that his ultimate weapon could be turned against him. "Abandon ship," Vexthal ordered reluctantly. It was the first time in his long military career that he had ever given such a command. The massive carrier exploded in a brilliant flash that lit up the entire system. Admiral Newton's combined fleet watched as debris scattered across space, marking the end of the Zephyrian flagship and its deadly weapon. But the battle was far from over. The remaining Zephyrian ships began to regroup, their crews working frantically to restore power and weapons. Even without their flagship, they still outnumbered the human defenders. Admiral Newton stood on the bridge of the transformed UES Horizon, studying the tactical display. His 20 years in deep space had changed him. Gray streaked his hair, and strange symbols marked his uniform, gifts from the alien allies who had taught him so much. "Charles, what's our next move?" asked Commander Lisa Wells, his second-in-command. "We've finished this," Newton replied. "But not the way they expect." Newton opened a communication channel to all ships, both human and Kaleri. "All vessels, execute. Formation pattern Alpha. Show them what real cooperation looks like." The combined fleet moved into a complex formation that had never been seen before in space combat. Human ships provided firepower and tactical coordination, while Kaleri vessels used their harmonic technology to create protective fields around the entire formation. Captain Morrison watched from the UES Defiance as the Allied fleet engaged the remaining Zephyrian forces. The enemy ships fought with desperate fury, but they were facing technology and tactics they had never encountered. "Captain, our systems are back online," Lieutenant Carter reported. "Should we join the attack?" Morrison shook his head. "No, we hold position and watch. This is Newton's show now." The Kaleri ships began to sing again, their crystalline hulls producing harmonies that traveled through space itself. The sound waves disrupted Zephyrian electronics and confused their targeting systems. Several alien cruisers collided with each other as their navigation failed. Meanwhile, the human ships demonstrated the quantum fold technology they had learned from their allies. They appeared and disappeared at will, striking at enemy vessels before vanishing into folded space. The Zephyrians found themselves fighting ghosts. Tony Adams, his fighter finally repaired, led the surviving human pilots in a final attack. But this time they were not alone. Kaleri fighter craft, looking like living jewels, flew alongside them. The combined squadrons swept through the enemy formation like a storm. "This is incredible," Adams called over the radio as he watched a Kaleri fighter phase through solid matter to attack an enemy ship from inside its shields. "How do they do that?" "Practice," came the reply from his Kaleri wingman, speaking perfect English through a translation device. On New Geneva, Dr. Foster finally got the shield generators back online. But as she watched the battle through her instruments, she realized they were no longer needed. The tide had turned completely in humanity's favor. "Doctor, should we restore full power to the shields?" Chief Engineer Garcia asked. "No," Foster replied with a smile. "I think we can save the power for rebuilding instead." The remaining Zephyrian ships were badly outnumbered and outmatched. One by one, they began to surrender or flee the system. The proud empire that had conquered dozens of worlds was being defeated by Alliance they had never imagined possible. Commander Vexthal, rescued from his destroyed flagship, found himself aboard a Zephyrian cruiser that was also badly damaged. He looked at the tactical display showing his fleet in full retreat and felt something he had never experienced before: complete defeat. "Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the human admiral," his communications officer reported. "Put it through," Vexthal said grimly. Admiral Newton's face appeared on the screen. Behind him, Vexthal could see both human and alien officers working together at their stations. "Commander Vexthal," Newton began, "I'm offering you one chance to end this war with honor. Withdraw your forces from all human territory, and we'll let your ships leave this system safely." Vexthal's forearms clenched into fists. Everything in his warrior culture told him to fight to the death rather than accept defeat. But he looked around at his bridge crew, young Zephyrians who deserved a chance to live. "And if I refuse?" Vexthal asked. "Then we'll destroy every ship in your fleet," Newton replied calmly. "But we'd prefer not to. The Kaleri have taught us that life is precious, even enemy life." Vexthal was silent for a long moment. He had seen what the combined human and Kaleri technology could do. His remaining ships had no chance against such power. "I accept your terms," Vexthal said finally. "But know this, human. The Zephyrian Empire will not forget this defeat." "I'm counting on it," Newton replied. "When your empire learns that humans are no longer alone, perhaps they'll think twice about conquest." The surviving Zephyrian ships gathered together and jumped to faster-than-light speed, fleeing the system they had come to conquer. For the first time in centuries, the Zephyrian Empire had been completely defeated. As the alien fleet disappeared into the darkness of space, cheers erupted across the human vessels. On New Geneva, millions of people emerged from their shelters to see the stars again. The nightmare was over, but for Admiral Newton and his crew, the real work was just beginning. The UES Horizon docked at New Geneva's main space station, and Newton finally set foot on a human world again after 20 years in exile. Captain Morrison was waiting for him at the airlock, along with Admiral Blake and the other survivors of the battle. The two old friends embraced, both knowing they had much to discuss. "Charles, I have 1,000 questions," Morrison said. "And I have 1,000 answers," Newton replied. "But first, let me introduce you to someone." A figure emerged from the Horizon's airlock behind Newton. It was clearly not human, with pale blue skin and large dark eyes, but it wore a human fleet uniform and spoke with a gentle voice. "This is Ambassador Kethavel of the Kaleri Collective," Newton explained. "They've agreed to establish permanent diplomatic relations with humanity." The alien ambassador stepped forward and offered what appeared to be a greeting gesture. "It is an honor to meet the defenders of New Geneva. Your courage has impressed the entire collective." Over the following weeks, New Geneva was transformed into something unprecedented in human history, the first joint human-alien colony. Kaleri engineers worked alongside human technicians to rebuild the damaged infrastructure, using advanced technologies that seemed like magic. Dr. Foster found herself leading a team of both species as they studied the quantum fold drives and harmonic resonance systems. The knowledge-sharing promised to advance human science by centuries. Tony Adams was selected to train as a pilot for the new hybrid fighters that combined human and Kaleri technology. The young man who had flown an obsolete ship against impossible odds now found himself at the forefront of a new age of spaceflight. Admiral Blake oversaw the construction of new defense platforms that used both human weapons and Kaleri shields. Never again would humanity be caught unprepared for invasion. 6 months after the battle, Admiral Newton stood in his new office overlooking New Geneva's rebuilt capital city. Through the windows, he could see children playing in parks where humans and Kaleri lived side by side. Construction crews worked on new buildings that incorporated the best of both species' architectural styles. Captain Morrison joined him at the window. "Hard to believe it's the same place where we almost died," Morrison said. "It's not the same place," Newton replied. "It's something new, something better." Morrison nodded, watching a group of human and Kaleri children chase each other through the gardens below. "What happens now, Charles?" "The Zephyrian Empire is still out there. Now we build an alliance that can stand against any threat," Newton said. "The Kaleri have introduced us to other peaceful species. Together, we can create something the galaxy has never seen. A coalition based on cooperation instead of conquest." As the sun set over New Geneva, the mixed fleet patrolled the system's borders. Human ships flew alongside Kaleri vessels, their crews working together with an efficiency that amazed observers. The flagship that had arrived in humanity's darkest hour had brought more than military salvation. It had brought the promise of a future where humanity would never stand alone again. The battle for New Geneva was over, but the real victory was just beginning. In learning to work with other species, humanity had discovered something more valuable than any weapon: the power of unity in a vast and dangerous universe.